So as we start Parshas Vayikra, hi there. We're going to be talking about as a central theme to these discussions are karbanos. That's what's going to be the central topic of much of Vayikra, also known as Torah Kohanim, the Leviticus, the laws of the priests, and central to what they do involves karbanos and the Beit Midrash. So theologically, karbanos is something we have to understand. We just came out of learning about the disputation, right? And one of the comments I don't think I mentioned, I don't think it comes up in the film, but the Ramban at one point he addresses King James and he says, you don't understand that there's so many elements of your religion that are just completely nonsensical, and you take them for granted. He said, I think the language he uses, it's in the marrow of your bones because you've been brought up this way, that you don't appreciate how ridiculous some of these things that you believe are. That's why we're discussing these things, and I'll tell you the truth. We have to occasionally, take a mirror, put it in front of us, and realize that there's a lot of things that if we think about them in the Chumash, at least at first glance, we might accept them and might say, oh, okay, that makes sense. But the more you think about it, the more you might have difficulty with understanding it. Karbanos is certainly one of those ideas, I think, something that we would have trouble with. Anybody have any ideas of what could be problematic about the concept of karbanos?
Well, if you consider the korban as a representation of the man, it's a pretty bad symbol, pretty bad.
You're taking the symbolic approach, which we'll get to, right? You think it doesn't suffice?
Not very good, no.
You already have an approach, though, that's good. What is that approach trying to address?
It's Sefer HaChinuch.
Right.
He was talking about the korbanos, what they represent. He says the person, the representation of the person. That's,
right. Before you took it in that direction, what's the motivation to take it in that direction? Why can't I say that there's something being achieved by my killing an animal for God? He doesn't need it, right? God doesn't need us to kill animals for Him, especially I think with our modern sensibilities where we're perhaps more aware. I mean, the Torah was always aware of this, of Tsar Balei Chaim, but we live in a world where the culture is now certainly geared towards appreciating that and realizing that's not something we'll do at least for no reason. So if God doesn't actually need these karbanos, so it sounds like we're not doing it for any good reason. More so than other mitzvahs, where we ask, what's the purpose in this? What are we accomplishing for God? When we're dealing with actually killing an animal to so to speak, serve God in this way, that's what makes it seem even harder to figure out. There's a certain, at first glance, a brutality to it that doesn't seem to improve us in any way. It doesn't seem to accomplish much. So why do we do it? Why is it something so central? Why is it something that we daven for on a regular basis, that we want to have the Beit Midrash back? We want to be able to have the opportunity to bring karbanos. So that's I think the main obstacle that people have that requires a certain explanation of what karbanos mean, what they're all about.
It also seems like pretty primitive and pagan that Rambam addresses that, but it does seem like, why do we? That's what the ill worshippers did.
Yeah, that's what they did back in the day when they were worshiping a god that was not true. So why would we want to make ourselves in any way similar to that? So with that, I think we'll start with the Rambam. As we mentioned earlier, this is just the English of the Moreh Nevuchim, of Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed, because it was originally written in Arabic. I feel like once we're going away from the original text, it may make sense to use a language that we're more comfortable with. So anyways, the Rambam has an approach. Now, one aspect of his approach we're going to read inside. The other aspect is one that the Ramban is going to Nachmanides is going to tackle head on in his commentary to this week's parsha. I'm just bringing this one up so that we can have a fuller picture of where the Rambam is going with this when he talks about what the purpose is of karbanos. So let's start. This is in the third part of Moreh Nevuchim. It's in chapter 32 within that one. So he says, it is namely impossible, and I'm selecting parts here. You'll see ellipses throughout the paragraph where I'm taking, it's a much longer article where he makes a lot of points. I'm selecting the things that I think are really crucial to understanding the approach. Otherwise we'd be here a lot longer if we read the whole thing. So, it is namely impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. Now God sent Moshe to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests and a holy nation by means of the knowledge of God. Right? So our mission ultimately is to be Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, as we've learned before. And we learned actually earlier, maybe according to some approaches, Kohanim could have actually meant priests, but we lost that schus with the Chet Egel perhaps. But At the very least, it means a certain sense of dignity, having a certain sense of royalty to us, of being the chosen nation. But the custom which was in those days general among all men, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images, and to burn, not bum, that's a typo, not on my part, I think, I copied and pasted this, to burn incense before them. Religious and ascetic persons were in those days the persons that were devoted to the service in the temples erected to the stars, as has been explained by us. And earlier in Nevuchim, the Rambam talks about what exactly idolatry is, and how it developed, and he talks about, there were people that were worshipping the stars, and they were sacrificing animals to them. So Rambam's giving us a little bit of a historical context. We very often we fall into the trap, I think, when we take our modern sensibilities, and we can make one of two mistakes. The Rambam's going to say that we're making the following mistake. He says that we're going to assume that the people living in those times had those same sensibilities that we have, which is a mistake. People thought very differently. The world was of a very different mindset, and many of the I think perhaps more refined ideas that have become more popular in the world actually come as a result of Judaism, as a result of ideas which the Torah has espoused, that have maybe developed in a slightly twisted way in other religions, but in general, there's a lot that we can give Judaism credit for in terms of the world becoming more refined in their sensibilities. But that wasn't the way things were back then. The Rambam is going to continue. With that mindset, it was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, has displayed in the whole creation, that He did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of service. For to obey such a commandment, it would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that which he is used to. Right. So to stop cold turkey, to just end our pagan practices, now that we're becoming the Jewish nation, it would have been too much. We wouldn't have been able to handle it. It would in those days have made the same impression as a prophet would make at present if he called us to the service of God and told us in His name that we should not pray to Him, nor fast, nor seek His help in times of trouble, that we should serve Him in thought and not by any action. Imagine you would have a Navi saying the following ideas. He'd be a Navi Sheker, because he's not allowed to say anything that goes against the Torah. But let's say theoretically a Navi came and he would, so to speak, be right. Can't be right when he's saying these things, but let's say somebody's right. He said, God says He doesn't want you to do any of these things anymore. All these ways that you're used to worshiping Him, not to be done. So, let's say even if we were to listen to him, which we shouldn't, that would be an Avi Sheker, but if we were to listen to him, we would have a very hard time, actually, because in many ways, we've certainly, I can imagine, worked hard in spiritual achievements and getting closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu by being Shomer Torah mitzvahs, but at the same time, when we continue living that lifestyle, it's in many ways a product of routine. We're used to serving God in a certain way. That if somebody was to tell us now you have to start doing things in a totally different manner, it would be very jarring. It would be something very hard for us to adjust to. So, Kiviyachol, when people were living life in a pagan manner, to just immediately go and snap into being a perfect Ovdei Hashem, in, I guess, the most ideal sense, that would have been a very hard adjustment to make. So the Rambam continues. For this reason, God allowed these kinds of service to continue, having some sense of korbanos and the like. He transferred to His service that which had formerly served as a worship of created beings and of things imaginary, unreal, and commanded us to serve Him in the same manner. Right? So He's saying, take those same actions that you used to do for Avodah Zarah, and now devote them to me instead. That's the Rambam's essential approach. We're going to elaborate a lot more on that. But before we go further, what could be difficult about such an approach? We touched on a similar theme a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the Mishkan. Any ideas?
First of all, it's a limited thing, because once you've made that transition, why are you keeping it? Like, I've gotten into arguments with people, what do you go back to Karbanos and Yudula based on? Like, what do you need it for? Like, they've served a transitional purpose, and then
right.
The point of continuing.
Right. So if it's a transition, it sounds like this should be a mitzvah that should eventually, live out its usefulness.
Right, exactly.
And although it's disappeared for us nowadays, it hasn't in the theoretical. We want the Beit Midrash back. We want to be able to do this again. Yeah. Right. If it fulfilled its goal, right? So that goal's been accomplished. You would think at that point this whole system should be abandoned, but we're not doing that. And the Rambam himself would certainly not say that you should do that. So there might be some more complicated idea here, but certainly that should be made clear. The Rambam never thought that we were going to abolish karbanos, abolish the system of a Beis HaMikdash and sacrifices in general. If you look at Mishnah Torah, the Rambam he tells you the halachos of these things. Even after the korban, he says we're going to have another Beis HaMikdash. We're going to be doing these things again, and we want them to happen again. So nevertheless, with this kind of understanding, you could certainly take that in a direction that the Rambam doesn't, but people can take that in a direction and say Karbanos will eventually be obsolete if they're not already. That there's a certain point in time where it's achieved its goals, we've been weaned off of idolatrous practices enough, and now we don't need it anymore. Right? So that's an approach somebody could take.
I think some of this played into the hands of the Reform, actually.
Absolutely, right. These are ideas which can certainly sow the seeds of that kind of thought.
Is that a legitimate approach among the Orthodox?
I do not think so. And even the Rambam, who said what we just read, would certainly not agree with that statement.
Even we pray for it.
We pray for it and we want it. And the Rambam is going to go on and address this more. And despite the idea that this might be in some ways bidi evid, right? It's something we want. So the Rambam continues. I know that you will at first thought reject this idea and find it strange, as we did. You will put the following question to me in your hearts. How can we suppose that divine commandments, prohibitions, and important acts, which are fully explained and for which certain seasons are fixed, should not have been commanded for their own sake, but only for the sake of some other thing, as if they were only the means which he employed for his primary object? In more simple language, it's how can you say that karbonos are something that are not intrinsically valuable, right? The idea that these are something that are just their purpose is only to wean us off of idolatry, that seems to cheapen the Torah in many ways. What prevented him from making his primary object a direct commandment to us and to give us the capacity of obeying it? Why can't we just go cold turkey? Why can't we just do everything right immediately? Those precepts which in your opinion are only the means and not the object would then have been unnecessary, right? So why don't we just stop being pagan, right? Very often when people quote the Rambam, it's important, that's why I wanted to quote the whole thing, they leave the Rambam's argument at that, and they don't elaborate more, and then when you learn the Ramban, who rejects the Rambam, he brings a lot of good arguments that we're going to see. They seem to say, he bested the Rambam. The Rambam has no answer to any of these things. He's got nothing to say. And look, he's making karbanos into a bidi evid, and that's just a totally horrible approach. The Rambam's acknowledging the problems that such an approach has right now, and he's going to elaborate. He's going to say why he thinks, nevertheless, this is an approach that you can, and according to the Rambam, should take. So he says, hear my answer, which will, not when, another typo, which will cure your heart of this disease and will show you the truth of that which I have pointed out to you. There occurs in the law a passage which contains exactly the same idea. It is the following. God led them not through the way of the land of the Plishtim, although that was near. For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war and they return to Egypt. But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Right? This is in Parshas Beshalach. Hashem sees that it wouldn't be a good idea to go take a direct route to Eretz Yisrael, because he saw there were armies that Klal Yisrael would not feel at least comfortable enough within themselves to be able to fight and to be able to just make headway into Eretz Yisrael. So they took a little bit of a roundabout route. That's even before Chet Egel, before Chet HaMeraglim, where they're destined to be in the desert for another 40 years. Even before there were punishments that required them to be in the Midbar for a longer period of time, Hashem was saying, we're not going to take the most direct route. That might be a little bit too much to go for right now. So the Rambam elaborates. Here God led the people about, away from the direct road which he originally intended, because he feared that they might meet on the way with hardships too great for their ordinary strength. He took them by another road in order to obtain thereby his original object. In the same manner, God refrained from prescribing what the people by their natural disposition would be incapable of obeying, and gave the above-mentioned commandments as a means of securing his chief object, that is, to spread knowledge of him among the people, and to cause them to reject idolatry. The Rambam says you have precedent. God's doing this with regards to where he's leading the Jewish people, taking them in a roundabout way that they don't encounter more than they can handle right away. So similarly, with regards to karbanos, you can have a certain weaning off period where we can't handle the total abandoning of idolatrous practices right away. So we're going to take a little bit of a more indirect route to get to an ultimate stage.
But that's not a good comparison, because again, one is just a temporary thing,
right.
So the other one.
Eventually, you're back in Eretz Yisrael. You're right where you belong.
Right. So it's not like something that's going to persist. Going to do that.
Right. So he's going to address this point. That point still hasn't been addressed that we mentioned. It sounds like according to this approach, we're going to abandon karbanos, but we're not. So how do we understand that? The Rambam also, by the way, he elaborates here. I'm skipping this part, but he elaborates after Chet HaMeraglim, when Klal Yisrael is actually in the desert for another 40 years. That actually serves another purpose also. That you're dealing with a people coming into Israel now who are very different demographically. These are not people who are slaves in Egypt, or at least not at an age where they were already mature. You had people that now the people coming into Israel were people that spent an entire 40 years in the desert being ennobled by God, and being shown how to be a chosen nation. In many ways it's hard to, reject and just lose that, that status, that feeling of being a slave. And it's not the kind of mentality that a person might want to go into when he's pioneering a new nation. So the Rambam also talks about how that it served that purpose also. You had a new generation that came into Israel that didn't have that baggage coming in. But anyways, so the Rambam continues back to our topic with Karbonos. As the sacrificial service is not the primary object of the commandments about sacrifice, whilst supplications, prayers, and similar kinds of worship are nearer to the primary object and indispensable for obtaining it, a great difference was made in the law between these two kinds of service. There's a very big difference between davening and karbonos, even though we very often link the two. The one kind, which consists in offering sacrifices, although the sacrifices are offered to the name of God, has not been made obligatory for us to the same extent as it had been before. We were not commanded to sacrifice in every place and in every time, or to build a temple in every place, or to permit anyone who desires to become priest and to sacrifice. On the contrary, all this is prohibited unto us. Only one temple has been appointed in the place which the Lord shall choose. In no other place is it allowed to sacrifice. Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest. Sorry, I didn't have regular English. And only the members of a particular family were allowed to officiate as priests. Here's where it comes on to our difficulty. All these restrictions serve to limit this kind of worship and keep it within those bounds within which God did not think it necessary to abolish sacrificial service altogether. In other words, the Rambam thinks that this is true. It's b'diavad. This is not the ultimate goal. It's meant to, again, wean us off of idolatry. But it wasn't didn't play as central of a role in Jewish practice to justify it eventually being abolished.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't.
Right. It still doesn't.
Beit Midrash is the most holy place on earth, and you were commanded to go there for the Shalosh Regalim.
Right.
Like it wasn't just some.
Right. You'll probably prefer the approach of the Rambam, but the Rambam acknowledges I think the tension that you have in this approach, that it sounds like there's things that are b'diavad here, and that nevertheless this is what the Torah commands the Dorei Doros forever. That this seems to be the ideal. He says it's not the ideal, but it's good enough that we can have it forever. That's essentially what he's saying.
At the time of Beit Midrash, they really didn't have formalized prayer. It was only after Beit Midrash was destroyed.
So formalized prayer you didn't have, but prayer has an institution. Certainly, it was a concept that existed in Jewish thought that I hope Jews in that time were making use of constantly. You just didn't have, perhaps, I guess, a codified prayer. That, the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah composing a Shemona Esrei, that kind of a thing. But the Rambam continues, but prayer and supplication can be offered everywhere. And by every person. The same is the case with the commandment of tzitzis. This is tefillin and similar kinds of divine service. Because of this principle, which I explained to you, the prophets in their books are frequently found to rebuke their fellow men for being overzealous and exerting themselves too much in bringing sacrifices. The prophets thus distinctly declare that the object of the sacrifices is not very essential, and that God does not require them. And that's a tension you find in Nevi'im also. There's a lot of remarks by the Nevi'im. We read them on fast days, and basically where, in the same way that fasting is not the be-all and end-all of a fast day. It's meant to, inspire ideas and thoughts of teshuvah, right? So a carbon is meant to bring those thoughts about. And the Nevi'im were complaining about the fact that people were bringing karbanos thinking that was all they had to do, and they didn't have the, emotional buy-in that a carbon is supposed to have with it, that it kind of defeats the purpose. The Rambam saying that makes perfect sense. If I view karbanos as not having any intrinsic worth, right? So then if that's all you're doing, then you're not doing anything really. If when it comes with, perhaps an appropriate mental, direction, so then there might be something to it. But without that, then this is really useless. He thinks that's what the Nevi'im mean when they have various criticisms that they lodge against people that bring karbanos without proper motivation. Anyway, so that's the only thing we're doing inside in the Rambam. He develops another idea, which the Ramban is going to go in also. But again, I wanted to just get the big picture of the Rambam first before we go and, tear him apart, as the Ramban will do. Okay, so the Ramban, in his commentary, he quotes the Rambam and his approach, but a different aspect that we haven't gotten into yet inside. So the Ramban says, "V'hini b'kasav hazeh tama karbanos." In this pasuk, with regards to, we'll quote it in a second, "Shehem ishei reach nichoach laHashem," that karbanos are a pleasing fragrance and aroma to God. That pasuk that encapsulates what karbanos are about. They're something that make God happy. They are something that makes God happy. V'amar harav b'mor nevuchim. The rabbi, he says in the Guide to the Perplexed that we just read. It's important to note, I think we mentioned this earlier, the Ramban had tremendous respect for the Rambam, unlike many other Chachamim of the time that had a lot to criticize the Rambam's works for. The Ramban had his criticisms, as he has here, that we're going to talk about, but he had tremendous respect for the Rambam as well. there's only two people in his entire commentary that he refers to as Harav. That's Rashi, who's a pretty big name in Jewish thought, and the Rambam. So he calls him Harav here. It shows a certain respect. But nevertheless, he's going to respectfully disagree. Kitama Karbanos. The Rambam says that the reason for Karbanos is the following. This is a different idea than we've read already, but I guess more elaboration of it. Bavur Sha'amitzim Ha'kazdim. When you're dealing with the Egyptians, the Kazdim, the people that lived in Eretz Yisrael during the time of Avraham Avinu, Asher Hayu Yisrael Garam V'Toshavim Ba'aretzam. This is the Jews lived in those lands at that time. The Kam, I think, there is in the wrong place. It should be right there. And then Me'olam Hayu Ovdim L'Bakar V'Latzon. The Egyptians, the Kazdim, they worshipped cows and sheep. Ki Amitzim Ovdim L'Tla V'Kazdim Ovdim L'Shedim. The Egyptians, they served sheep, right? As we might know from the Yosef story, right? Yosef tells his brothers, you're not going to eat with them because they find you repulsive, that you guys eat sheep and all that stuff. And the Kazdim, they worshipped demons. Asher Yiru Lahem B'Demus Seirim. And they envisioned that demons took the form of goats. I think that's where it comes from. I think your typical picture of like a devil, right, with the pitchfork. He's also got like goat like that kind of picture eventually evolved from I think this concept. And the people of India, even till this day, in the Ramban's day, they wouldn't think to slaughter a cow. And I think that's true nowadays also. You have Hindus. I looked into this a little bit before Shir. Hindus, they don't worship the cow per se, but they have a tremendous amount of respect for it. They don't eat meat. Right? They say, why would you kill the cow? You got all this great milk and all this other stuff that they use. They use not a number of the derivatives of the animal, some in disgusting ways, I think, to us. But they also have something called, let's see what I got here, Gopastami. So essentially, it's a cow appreciation day. They clean up all their cows, they decorate them, and that's apparently their gesture to ensure that they continue to get the gifts from their precious cows for the next year. But anyways, they treat cows with great respect. It might be that in the Ramban's time, earlier than that, it was even more idolatrous, that it might have been that they actually worshipped them. But anyways, בעבור כן ציווה לשחוט אלו השלושה המינים לשם הנכבר כדי שיודע כי הדבר שהיו חשובים כי הם בתכלס העבירה. Right? This is why the Rambam says, again, this is not what we saw inside, but this is another aspect that the Rambam points out. These three types of animals, right, that the idolatrous nations worshipped: cows, sheep, and goats. So we take those and we kill them, right? We sacrifice them, and this is something that they think is like the most serious avera you could possibly do. Those very animals, we take them and we sacrifice them to God. And through that's how we actually get atonement for our sins. Forget that we're not doing an avera; it actually takes the sins off the record. And the Rambam says through taking these animals and bringing them as karbanos, it's what heals us from these diseases of the soul, which Avodah Zarah gives to us. There's a general principle of healing that if you want to heal a certain condition, you have to take things in the opposite extreme in some ways. These are essentially what the words of the Rambam, and he goes at length more concerning this. But this is an additional aspect of the Rambam besides what we saw inside in the Moreh Nevuchim. Besides the idea that we're being weaned off of idolatry, it's also in many ways meant to be a shtuch to idolatry. It's meant to say, look, we're taking the very things you respect that you would not sacrifice, and we're sacrificing them, we're killing them. That in some ways you could see that as in perhaps being contradictory to the first idea that we saw. But in any event, the Rambam says both of them. It's important to note that the Rambam, in his introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim, he says, I'm going to tell you things that are going to be confusing and might seem contradictory. You got to think about them, and you'll be able to make sense out of them if you think hard enough. So I'm not sure exactly what to do with that, but the Rambam, he gives that as a little bit of a caveat before even starting his Sefer. Okay. Anyways, V'nehim divrei Havai. The Ramban starts his criticism of the Rambam's approach. He says, this is nothingness, these words. He's taking a severe wound, a tremendous question that you might have on karbanos, but he's, I think, very matter-of-factly, very casually trying to heal it. He's trying to resolve a big issue, theologically, in a very simplistic and problematic way. Right? This is actually those words, I think, are a paraphrase of a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Nechama Leibovitz, she points out in her studies that in context, that pasuk in Yirmiyah is actually a reference to the Nevi'ei Sheker, the false prophets of Yirmiyahu's time, they said there isn't going to be a churban, everything's going to be great, keep doing what you're doing, and it made the people feel at ease about the potential threats of enemies. But at the same time, it didn't really solve the problem because it wasn't true, right? It wasn't. It made them feel good, but at the end of the day, you're going to have a much bigger problem on your hands because of that. People didn't repent for that reason, and therefore they eventually got destroyed from these people that the Nevi'im told them were not so dangerous. So she suggests that what the Ramban is trying to do by quoting this pasuk as the start of his criticism to the Rambam is that it's going to make a much bigger problem. If you think that we have a difficulty theologically of understanding karbanos, and you've solved it by saying, yeah, really, it's b'diavad, this is part of weaning us off of avodah zarah. It's not really something that God cares about all that much. It's not something He really wants. So then it's going to make trying to find deeper meanings and studying karbanos in depth much more trivial. And I'm learning Daf Yomi for the past couple of weeks, substituting for Daf Yomi here, and we're learning Tamura. And I was jumping into the middle of a sugya and really breaking my head on a lot of complicated details of karbanos. And somebody that's going to those masechtas, thinking about these obscure ideas in the laws of sacrifices, and you come in thinking the way the Rambam thinks, so really God doesn't really care about this all that much. It makes it a lot harder, to learn these things in depth. And so, why am I doing this anyway? So the Rambam didn't have that thought. Like we said, in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam certainly agreed that karbanos are an important institution, that they are a part of Jewish law, now and forever. But that being said, when you have this, philosophy behind what karbanos are all about, it's hard to get into it. It's hard to appreciate it if you think it's b'diavad ultimately. So, anyways. The Rabban continues. Yasef Shulchan Hashem Megual. He made God's table polluted. She'inenu rak lahotzi miliban sharasham v'tipshei olam. He makes the karbanos. The Rambam makes them as if their true purpose is really just to get false ideologies of evil, foolish people out of their minds. V'akasav Amar. But the pasuk says, Ki him lechem yishei reach nichach laHashem. That the karbanos, they are they're food to God. They're a pleasing fragrance. Sounds like they're intrinsically valuable. V'gam ki lefish tusam shel mitzim lo Furthermore, the Rambam thinks this is going to cure our, so to speak, disease of Egyptian, avodah zarah kind of thoughts. It's not going to heal us from this illness. It's going to make our wounds even worse. These people, these evil, wicked people, they thought that their animals represented certain constellations, certain powers. They therefore would not eat these creatures, right? Because they thought these were they had a certain chashivas, importance to them. If you were to take these animals in and then slaughter them for the sake of God, the one true God, they would view that as an honor to it. Right? We have to remember, I think we talked about this in Parshas Kitisa, that avodah zarah takes many shapes and forms. Avodah zarah isn't only thinking that a certain statue is a god, right? It's also thinking that the sun, moon, and stars, etc., are intrinsically, inherently powerful, but nevertheless subservient to God, right? That they have some certain sense of independent will, but they're subservient to God. God doesn't want that either. That's also called avodah zarah. So the Ramban is saying, if you had people that viewed avodah zarah in that kind of a way, that let's say the certain constellations are ones that they worshipped as servants of God, it's also avodah zarah, but they worship them as servants of God. So then you take the animals that they represent and you shech them in honor of God. They would view that as, oh, that's great, that's fine. I don't want you making a barbecue out of my cow, but if you're going to take that cow and you're going to sacrifice it in honor of the one true God, that's great too, right? So the Ramban says it's not going to solve our problems. The Ovdei avodah zarah are going to be perhaps strengthened by these practices. And furthermore, the people that worship the avodah zarah, they did this themselves. Kamosha Amar, like it says in Vayikra, further on, that we're not going to get to in this week's parsha. And you'll get to a point in history where people will no longer bring karbanos to the demons, right? We mentioned the Kazdim earlier worshiping demons, and apparently they brought karbanos to them. They took their goats that they thought represented it and actually sacrificed it for the sake of their god. And more, go back to Chet Egel. What did people do at Chet Egel? They brought karbanos to the Egel, right? So this is avodah zarah can take the form of karbanos too, right? It's not just respecting an animal and therefore letting it be. Sometimes you can take that animal and sacrifice it to what they viewed as a higher power. Even the Rambam acknowledges that there were karbanos that were brought to the moon. every new month. And also to the sun at times where it arranged itself in a certain way that it was, within their constellation, and there was a propitious time for them for bringing karbanos. It would be much better if we were taking the Rambam's approach that this is meant to correct the Avodah Zarah thoughts, that we should just eat these animals and to our fill. Instead of having karbanos, have barbecues. That's what you combat Avodah Zarah. That's what they really find repulsive. To take that cow and make it as a steak, that's what they would find repulsive, and that's what we should do, according to the Rambam's approach. So rather, can't be. He's going to bring a couple of other arguments. But, okay, so let's continue. Noach, he leaves the Teva way back in Parshas Noach. These were his 3 sons, the rest of his family. There were no Kazdim, there were no Mitzrim, there were no Egyptians, there were no Ovdei Avodah Zarah in the world at that point. Nevertheless, he brought a carbon. It was good in the eyes of God. But Amar Bo says concerning these carbonos that Noach brought, God smelled a pleasant odor. And again from there, Amar El Libo Lo Osif Od Kal Es Adama Ba'avor HaAdam. God says, after smelling, so to speak, those sacrifices, you have to understand this more. But he said, okay, because of that, I'm not going to curse the ground anymore. I'm not going to flood the ground anymore. So you see, by Noach, you had a situation where before Avodah Zarah even existed, you had Avodah Zarah existed at that time. That's why there was a flood in the first place. One of the reasons why there was a flood. But when Noach lands, there's no one left. And still there's this institution of karbanos. So that's pretty problematic. And if you want to tell me still it's to wean off the ideas of Avodah Zarah that existed from the people that lived prior to the flood, the next proof is going to be much more straightforward.
You also say about Cain and Hevel.
Exactly, right now. And that's what the Ramban's going to do. Hevel, one of the first people in the world to exist, way before Avodah Zarah existed in any way. He brought karbanos from his sheep and from its fats. Vayisha Hashem el Hevel min chasa. Vayisa Hashem el Hevel min chasa. God lifted up. He accepted Hevel's offerings. There was no hint of Avodah Zarah in the world at all, whatsoever. Uvilam Amar, with regards to Bilam, this is perhaps a little bit more complex of a proof. He says, right, Bilam says, I've arranged 7 altars, I've brought a cow and a ram on each of them. That end quote. Well, what's Bilam's purpose? Why is he bringing those karbanos? He wasn't doing that, obviously, to get rid of certain idolatrous ideas from his head. He was a pretty bad guy. He wasn't commanded to do this either. He did this so that he could more easily approach God and be able to speak to him, ask for permission to curse the Jewish people, which was right. It's always striking when you read Parshas Balak. Bilam sounds like quite a firm guy. Right? He's constantly asking Hashem for permission, wanting to talk to Hashem, wanting to get close to him. That's what he's trying to do with these karbanos.
He's not actually wanting to get close to him. He's wanting to manipulate God.
Right. So Bilam's not in fact a good guy. If you look more carefully in the Psukim, you'll see where he
God's
was wrong.
But there's an Avodah Zarah in the concept that you try to manipulate God, because that's what the ancients did.
Right.
They had gods that they could manipulate.
It's very striking the way we paint the picture of Bilam as such a bad guy, and then if you were to read the Psukim without any commentaries and not look at it carefully, you could get the impression that he keeps saying, I'm not going to do anything unless God asks. Right? But you're right. Ultimately, Chazal saw through that, and they realized that Bilam was really trying to...
He worships God in the way that others worshipped Avodah Zarah.
Right.
And that's forbidden.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so that's the point of Parshas Balak that maybe we'll come to at another point. But anyways, right? This is the most important idea that supports the Ramban's approach. You have to say karbanos have an intrinsic value. God seems to take a lot of joy in them. They're His bread, so to speak. They're a pleasing fragrance to Him. Chas v'shalom, that you should say that they have no intrinsic purpose. That is just meant to eliminate the thoughts of Avodah Zarah. So he seems to reject the Rambam pretty much out of hand. Brings a lot of good questions on it. Anybody think of any ideas we might be able to use to defend the Rambam? It's not a good machlokas if the Rambam just wins. Okay? Any ideas?
Well, it's the Rambam is saying in the Chumash itself, it mentions about the sheep in Egypt. So there's a clear basis there. Now it may not hold in every other case, but definitely the Korban Pesach is related to the fact that it was a an idol for the Egyptians. So the Rambam is right on that part.
I think you have Midrashim of Chazal. The Abarbanel points this out when he wants to defend the Rambam. He says there are a lot of Midrashim that would seem, at least certain readings of them, to support this idea that the Rambam's advancing, that this is a concession in many ways. And the ideas of Karban Pesach is an example of them, right? That is meant to deny the Egyptian God, right? But at the same time, to say that there's no intrinsic value to Karbanos at all. So that's hard to say in light of Hevel bringing Karbanos, of Noach bringing Karbanos. And just the fact that to us it seems very strange to say that Karbanos are b'diavad. In many ways, it's something that we have as a mitzvah for generations and generations that we daven for every day. For that to be b'diavad is kind of strange.
It also seems like there's no sense that you're weaning if something is permanent.
Right. Right. We mentioned that earlier. Yes.
You're actually instituting it. You're not saying this will go on for 100 years.
Right.
You're saying.
The Rambam mentioned in Moreh Nevuchim that we read earlier. He says it's true, that's a difficulty, and he says, but Hashem thought in the grand scheme of things, Karbanos are useful enough for this purpose that even though they'll essentially be obsolete at a certain point in time, you should still practice them. God wanted it to be a mitzvah for all generations because of the function it served when it was first instituted. That's essentially what he says.
It's like we'll stay on methadone.
Yes, basically.
But also,
better than heroin.
Also on the Rambam side, we only make coconut from kosher animals. So you could say, well, what if somebody was making an idol from a horse, right? So are we going to make coconut from horses? No, we don't do that. So it suggests that maybe it's b'diavad because there's another purpose for the coconut, like people eat them, or even if it's a korban halah, it still has to be a kosher animal. So it means it's not exactly because of that one reason.
Absolutely. That's the approach that I think most people that come to defend the Rambam take. What the Rambam said, and you'll note if you look in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam never says anything, I think, to denigrate Karbanos. He never says, this system that I guess drives his approach. He never says, this system of Karbanos, it makes no sense. Why do we do this here? Let me tell you why we do it. It's really b'diavad. We don't really want to do it. He doesn't say that. He goes into his approach right away. He doesn't say that Karbanos are a meaningless system at face value. And I think with that gives you the ability to say, as Abarbanel does and others say as well, that Karbanos have intrinsic value. They do. Right? We'll get into exactly what that is perhaps in the next paragraph in the Ramban. But it also had this role of weaning us off of Avodah Zarah and denying many Avodah Zarah practices.
But the ancients actually slaughtered these animals to the same God.
Right, so that's touching again on this conflict that we have. Is it to deny them, or is it to deny what they believed in, or was it to sublimate what they believe in towards God? Right, the Rambam seems to be playing both sides of the fence in many ways. But it could be that it applies in certain situations one way, in other situations another way. But the way the Abarbanel says it is basically there is an intrinsic value to Karbanos. That's what Cain and Hevel were doing. That's what Noach was doing. But that's not enough to bump it up to, say, the level where it should be a mitzvah to do it. Right? To get it to be a mitzvah, it has to have certain other values in place as well, and that's the things that the Rambam is getting into. That's essentially the approach, and you're basically making the Rambam agree with the Ramban to some extent. And he probably has to, because if you were to ask the Rambam, we never got a chance to. What does he say about Cain and Hevel's Karbanos? He'd be forced to say something about saying something like this.
Isn't there? It seems to me there's an issue of who's copying who. There's a sense we're copying the idol worshippers, but you could argue the idol worshippers are actually copying monotheists of a previous generation.
Absolutely. We have such a phenomenon we mentioned when we talked about the Avos keeping the Torah. I think we talked about how the Avos brought bamos. They made private altars, which eventually became forbidden because after the Avos, pagans started using them and God didn't like them anymore.
Right.
I mean, we might have done it first, or Cain and Hevel weren't Jewish, but it might have been used in an appropriate way first. It got corrupted, and then
Matzeva.
Right, Matzeva, right. So you have such a phenomenon also.
There's something to be said for a change in human psyche over time. This is listening to Rabbi Molesky talking on this. He said that 2,500 years ago there was a whole change. He didn't explain why, but in the human psyche, the attitude towards Korbanot, and we lost it. We basically started losing it at that time. Do you feel that if the Beit Midrash were rebuilt tomorrow, that everyone would be just thrilled to go slaughtering animals and all that?
I don't think we would be. That's the problem. That's why we're tackling this issue.
There's been a metamorphosis. There's been a change in our psyche towards this.
Did he mention any connection? I mean, I can imagine somebody would connect these ideas of getting rid of the taiva, the desire for avodah zarah. that it has a cost to it.
Right.
That in many ways.
It's an interesting thing because the campaign of the Torah may be much more effective than we realize it is. If you talk to people of religions that we consider to be avodah zarah in detail, they will explain to you today that it's not really.
It's not. What's not really what?
As we say that there's an angel for every blade of grass above, right? They say we have forces too, right? But we know that there's a single creative force in the universe. Right? I'm not sure that they always believe this, right? That the foundation of those faiths believe it. But it may have been that they have made some changes over time as well to move away from it, still keeping their faith. But
absolutely. I think there's an evolving sensibility. So we mentioned that earlier. We said there's really two mistakes. We only talked about one of them so far, I think. Two mistakes that we can make when we approach a certain topic.
And by the way, and our connection to avodah zarah obviously is much weaker.
Right.
And we had this tremendous taiva for it one time.
And then in some ways can be said because the way the Rambam system works, it may have done its job.
Exactly.
They were at the point where you would say Karbanos have outlasted their utility to the point where now it seems like they're strange.
And if you do tefillah in the proper sense, tefillah is actually supposed to change you. It's not supposed to be that you just go on the road and run out and that's it. It's actually supposed to change you, which is what the korban did too. You got karov la Hashem. So if you really daven the way we're supposed to daven, which we don't do usually, so maybe that's what was supposed to do. That was supposed to be a substitute, maybe to wean us from one to get up to the real.
Right, that's important. But we haven't discussed it. We've talked about all the problems of the Rambam's approach, but what's your alternative? So we have to get into that. It's similar to what you're saying.
But tefillah as a substitution is a result of the destruction of the Torah.
So we talked about this earlier. A substitution.
As a replacement to Torah.
Yeah, in many ways we link the thoughts of tefillah and karbanos together.
They existed together.
Right. There was tefillah in the times of the Beit Midrash.
Right.
It wasn't formalized in the way that you and I have it, but it existed.
Yeah, but isn't it true that the more you learn about the karbanos, right, it's as if you actually sacrifice the karban.
That's what we say, right?
Right?
I don't know, not in the most literal sense that we would say, who needs a Beit Midrash anymore? I'll just learn about it instead. We definitely don't take it that far.
No, we learn it to practice it.
Right, absolutely.
It's not possible now, but that's why we learn it.
So we hope to do it one day, right? We daven for it every day. The Rambam, even the Rambam would say that we do it. We're going to hope for it every day.
But don't we have an intrinsic bloodlust in us?
And therefore?
Therefore, karbanos makes sense.
I feel like that makes it not make sense. It's just a self-satisfying, just want to see some gore. That's very difficult.
But the other thing is that Rambam's argument, or our argument that it succeeded and we've been weaned off it, has very little basis in our history. We know that the end of those kind of desires in avodah zarah was a result of the men of the Great Assembly. That they davened for it, they captured it, and they destroyed it.
And therefore?
It wasn't a result of korbanos weaning itself. It was a dramatic change in our psychology. I mean, I don't think we even have a sense of what that desire is.
Right, so that's going to be the Ramban's approach. It has an intrinsic worth that we don't appreciate, that we have to get into.
But what I'm saying is the destruction of it was not being weaned off it. It was actually an act of the men of the Great Assembly.
Yeah.
And with it, by the way, we lost prophecy for the time.
Absolutely. So we have to perhaps take an approach that doesn't mean the rest of the world was thinking incorrectly back then and we know better now. But perhaps there's the opposite approach. Perhaps karbanos had a value that we don't appreciate now and that they did back then. So then what are we going to say? So the Ramban continues. He quotes an approach that is attributed to Ibn Ezra. He doesn't say quote Ibn Ezra outright, but the Ramban says the following. It's the paragraph that starts with Vayoser. It's the last big paragraph. So he says, it's better perhaps to say the approach that many say. Ibn Ezra, I think, is the one that says it primarily. Since man, he accomplishes things through thought, speech, and deed. Hashem says when a person does an aveira, he has to bring a carbon in many situations. He leans his hands on the animal, that's to represent his wrongdoing in action. Right? He confesses his sin on top of the animal. That's meant to express the fact that he sinned in speaking also. And he burns up the innards, the kidneys of the animal, because those are the organs. I'm not sure whether the biology that we have nowadays will support this idea, but those were the organs which drive our desires. You could say, I guess, the innards, our stomach, our hunger, our drive for food, let's say. That's what's telling us to eat. The kidneys, I'm not as sure what they accomplish for us now, in that sense. Our limbs, not our limbs, the limbs of the animal, those are burned because those are the vehicles with which we accomplish these averas. We run to do averas. We do things with our hands, whatever it is. We take the blood of that animal. We sprinkle it on the mizbeach to parallel the blood in our soul that represent our souls, so to speak. That through doing all these actions, he is communicating to God that he sinned towards him through his body, through his mind. And it should be his own blood that's being spilled. It should be his own limbs that are being burned. If it wasn't for the fact that Hashem, in His mercy, allowed a replacement, so to speak. And there was a process of repentance by which this animal's blood can be in place of our own blood. Nefesh tachas nefesh. This animal's soul can be in place of our soul. And that the limbs of this animal can be instead of our own limbs. And the parts of the carbon that you give to the Kohanim to eat as a gift, that's so that they daven for you. It's like the Kupat Ha'ir. It's donate to them, they'll daven for you. You know.
This is what I sort of was inferring.
Right. This is what you mentioned at the beginning of the class.
An internal bloodlust that we can accept this. We can accept that the carbon is a replacement for us.
I don't know if this is. I don't think the person that's doing this probably doesn't have the reaction of, "This is awesome. I get to kill this thing instead of killing myself." No. He thinks there's a chesed of Hashem, to be sure, but it's supposed to, I think, also breed a certain sense of remorse. What should be really is that I'm the one that should be here, right?
Right.
And it makes him very humbled.
But in the meantime, you've got this poor animal who's being sacrificed.
Right.
So if you had such a hate, not a hate, but a disgust, you wouldn't do it. But you can handle that.
And if a person felt strongly enough about animal rights, they'd say, "Yeah, you should be on that mizbeach. Forget the animal."
See the way the Kohen made the korban, he cut it in pieces.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one little cut. He did a complete job on the animal, right? And the person who brought it is watching, and he's appreciating it. You know what I'm trying to say?
Right, but appreciating not in the sense of a bloodlust as much of a man. I'm really glad.
Bloodlust, but I should say you can appreciate what the Kohen is doing.
No, but he should be feeling
other than
himself. It is a vicarious.
It should be that this is the Nez's approach.
Is yourself.
I don't think we don't have the psyche for that. I don't think at this point I can't associate with that. I still feel sorry for the poor animal over there. It should be me up there.
We should feel bad when this is happening. Absolutely.
But I think there was a different psyche there. I don't know why. It was a different something else at that time that I don't think we can appreciate really.
I imagine in the same way, Beit Midrash will come if you want to take this approach of Ibn Ezra and run with it. In the same way, you have to, I think, prime your mind to be ready for tefillah, for connecting to God in a certain way. You probably have to read like this Ibn Ezra before you brought a carbon. You probably have to think, and I have to remember that this limb is for that limb, etc. You probably have to bring this mindset in with you, and you'd have to make an effort to do so, because it's not the way people naturally feel.
Not now, anyway.
Right.
I don't think we're more refined now than they were.
I'm not saying it's refined. It's different. We just have a different psyche. I'm not saying we're more refined necessarily. What's that midrash that we learn about? That a rabbi came to another rabbi in a dream and said, if you were here, he was able to solve all the problems for him. And he said that you were an idol worshiper. If you were here, we'd lift our skirts, we'd lift our robes to run to the.
That was Menashe,
right? So it was a different psyche then. Like there was such a desire for that.
a desire for
korbanot at that time, because
right. Ultimately, the answer can be what we're referring to earlier, that there's just there was a different drive, there was a different motivation, way of thinking back then that we totally don't comprehend now.
That's it. That's right.
And I think that's what we're going to get into in the next, I guess, mini approach. We'll talk about it. Right. That's an important point. I think the Ibn Ezra's approach here that the Ramban is quoting, this only addresses one kind of carbon. The carbon that I have to bring as an obligation because I did an Avera. What about the ones that I'm bringing voluntarily? Harder to explain what purpose this serves. Right? Is there any way you can, I guess, make this idea work for an Ola to make this in some way be an expression of love?
Everyone shares it. The Kohen, your
friend. Besides the ones that I eat, an Ola, let's say, a voluntary Ola, which can exist also. So where it goes entirely up, right? How can that communicate, I guess, a similar idea? You would have to work on it, but that might be a shortcoming of this approach.
Does there have to be one idea to explain different types of korbanot? Maybe one type has one idea, another type has another idea. It doesn't have to be exactly. There doesn't be any similarity.
So we have to think of, therefore, a different approach to explain the voluntary korbanos, the ones that are not a response to a sin, right? So this won't give us the full picture. And the Ramban continues, V'karban tamid. What about the tamid? That's a type of chatas in some way, the way he understands it. Since the public, we can't be perfect. Somebody's going to sin at some point in the past day. So therefore, it serves as so to speak a chatas for the community. These are words that you can accept. They are appealing to the heart, like the words of the Agada. Sounds like it's almost like a backhanded compliment. I feel like when you read that, it sounds like that's nice. It's a nice idea. It has certain shortcomings, I think, that we've pointed out, and then especially when you see what the Ramban goes on to, or what you won't see, because I'm going to have to tell it to you in very brief. V'aderech ha'emes, the Ramban says, in the way of the truth, meaning he's about to give you a Kabbalistic answer. Yish b'karbanos so nelan. There is a hidden secret contained in the offerings. Because. I cannot understand what he was saying at all. I'll be honest. He talks about an approach that essentially talks about the fact that every single time you talk about karbanos, in these parashas, it only refers to bringing a carbon to Hashem, the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, not Elokim, not Shakai, not any other word. And he goes in, he develops that in a way that I don't understand. But in some way that I've seen people give it over, I have the next, like I'm quoting tiny bits and pieces of it. The whole carbon lashon kreiv achdus, like we mentioned earlier, the root word of carbon is karav, to be close. It's unification with God in some way. May the good Lord pardon. That's a reference to the fact that the Ramban feels very uncomfortable even putting whatever he wrote in writing. He's not comfortable with sharing certain Kabbalistic ideas, even if no one that maybe shouldn't be reading them could even understand in the first place, like myself. But he's saying, I had to do this because there are certain horrible ideas that are coming out and trying to explain karbanos. I have to resort to telling you the Kabbalistic approach because that's what's the truth. There's a much deeper idea to karbanos than the Ramban is letting on in what we saw in that previous paragraph. And he elaborates on it there. You're welcome to give it a try. If you wanted to open up a Chumash and look in the Ramban, I'm not sure what he's getting onto. I've seen people explain it. I don't know if this is the same thing as the Ramban's approach, but Rav Hirsch, let's say, he emphasizes this idea that karbanos, their root word is kuf reish beis, to be close. He understands it as being an approach of giving a gift to God. I mean, the way you can understand that Kabbalistically is we have an obstacle here, right? The idea that I'm giving something to God is very difficult to comprehend. God doesn't need anything. So what does it mean to give to God? So that might be the sod, that might be the secret here. That even though you can't give to God, you're still giving to God. I've heard people bring a mashal.
There's a difference between the need of the receiver and
right.
the need of the giver.
And that's where this comes down to. I think I've heard a mashal of a kid that brings, he takes like dandelions from a field somewhere, brings it to his mother. They can be very ugly flowers that the mother doesn't need at all. She doesn't really want them at all. But she says, great, beautiful. She puts them in a vase. She displays them proudly. She shows how much she's proud of her child and the closeness that the child wants to express to his mother. I've heard the mashal then go on, and the child he views it as a chore. Eventually, he just throws the flowers in her face, and she throws them in the garbage. She says, "I don't really need these things, so forget it. I was doing this so that you would feel good, that you could give to me in some way." But you're not doing. You're not coming to it with the right approach, which Klal Yisrael had with the karbanos at a certain point in history. So forget the Beit Midrash, forget the flowers.
And whatever it is, lost that approach at a certain time too.
What do you mean?
There are a lot of complaints from the Levim about how to bring korbanos later on.
Right, that's what the Ramban alluded to.
Initially, we have a desire to give the finest flowers.
Right.
Later on,
korbanos done incorrectly can be very harmful, and really they don't accomplish much when they're not brought with the corresponding korbanos.
They're counterproductive. They're counterproductive.
Right. In many ways, they're insulting. Right.
Yeah.
That could certainly be the case.
And
so
God says so. It's not what I'm looking for. At that point, that's not what
he says himself. Do I need these korbanos?
Yeah. So there's some deep secret here. I think it might be able to be explained. I don't know if you can really read the Ramban's words this way, but it is an approach I've seen other people take. That you're giving to God, even though He doesn't really need to be given to. And that's in some ways a paradox that we can understand through Mashalim, to understanding how it works in this world. That there's a benefit to the giver even when there's no benefit received by who you're giving to.
That's wonderful. That's nice. Okay, it's a nice thought. But why live animals? Why not just keep it to flour and oil?
When you develop that idea further, I think it's...
Hirsch actually comments on it. He says that the animals are very specific representatives. Why do some people bring sheep and some people bring an ox? Right? An ox is an animal that works. It carries a yoke. The person who brings an ox thinks of himself as, I failed at doing the job that I have for God. The person who sees himself as a sheep doesn't work hard. He's taken care of.
Right? I mean, there's a representative value of each animal.
The person who sees himself as a sheep, which is a less expensive korban, but many say it's a higher level korban, actually. Why? Because the person who sees himself as a sheep says, I've been taken care of by God all along. I've been fed, I have a shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd, literally, right? And then, in spite of that, I did averas. That's much worse than the person who says, I didn't do my job right? So that you're actually seeing the animals as representing your nature in it. The idea of bringing animals, we don't really have that big a problem with slaughtering animals. We do it constantly all day.
From that, right. Yeah. That's another point.
If you watch it.
What?
Right, we don't watch it.
In the Beit Midrash, you're watching your korban.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that just that's a technicality.
In Europe, they were watching.
No, but, it wasn't that long ago that I know people. Yeah, there's a woman in my house like 2 days ago talking to my wife about the chicken that she used to bring home before they shechted it. We had to know the chicken. Right? When the time came that it had to be shechted, it was shechted. Right? Yeah. This is not somebody from 2,000 years ago, right? It was, it was part of it. We have, in many ways, in a negative way, anesthetized ourselves from the process of where meat comes from. Meat is the ultimate form of judgment. The animal is giving up its life on a regular basis.
The whole idea, though, of even slaughtering, forget sacrifice, but for us, is a b'diavad. It was giving in. These first generations were vegetarians. If you go to the Chumash,
that's the bigger conversation of slaughtering animals.
That's right. That's right. So this is also a b'diavad in itself. Okay, because ideally what we're supposed to be doing is being vegetarian.
That's an important point to bring up also.
Because from the time of Adam it was like that. I think it was that after the flood, I think that he then allowed, it was an allowance.
The generation of the flood was the ones that began to, they misunderstood the relationship between man and animal.
But then it became allowed.
It became allowed in order that we understand that the animal is there to serve us, not to be a partner.
Right. So once if you manage to find any reason that speaks to you with karbanos, so then this is no longer just a wasteful thing. This is no longer tzar b'alei chayim. That's an important principle in Judaism. We're allowed to shecht animals when it serves a purpose to us. Right? We're
So Don, you're going?
Sorry?
Next door.
Yeah. One other idea I've seen when we're talking about why animals. Right, so animals can represent certain things for sure, but also it's important to keep in mind that was considered like the most valuable commodity they had at the time. Right? We think of our cars, our electronics, whatever it is that's expensive to us now. People viewed wealth as a function of how many animals did you have, that kind of a thing. Right, it was a much bigger investment in our minds now back then. Right, it was a bigger sacrifice. It's important. There's no real good translation of the word korban, but in many ways the word sacrifice will have some role in that. Offering would perhaps have a role in that. Perhaps the more willful giving aspect of things, but essentially we don't really have a good word. Perhaps closeness facilitator would probably be the closest thing you could have to a definition. But with that, we'll finish. All right, Yeshua everyone.